Let's start off week 2 with a discussion of standards of review, which is absolutely critical to understanding constitutional law 2. And this will likely be the first time I mention this to you, at least in common law 2. On the bar exam, 50% of the questions, of the multiple choice questions, the multi-state bar exam questions, MBE, 50% of those questions in constitutional law test only the standards of review. So you don't have to know what the right answer is. Obviously, in constitutional law, it's often very hard to know what the right answer is. But what the bar examiners expect you to know when they give you a fact pattern is what standard of review, what level of review, what level of scrutiny, right? There are different ways to put this. What level of scrutiny, what standard of review applies in that case? What test applies? For example, from Con Law 1, when you see a dormant commerce problem, you need to know whether Pike applies or whether strict scrutiny applies, that kind of thing. So it is really important that we nail this down. And when we're talking about substantive due process, there are only 2 levels of scrutiny or standards of review that are in play. Those are strict scrutiny and rational basis review. And this makes a lot of sense. There are certain rights, because we can claim any right as a constitutional right. I can claim the right to shave in the morning, I can claim the right to swim in a pool, I can claim the right to, you name it, do anything. Claim that that's a constitutional right. But the court has said there are certain rights, certain parts of a person's life that are so fundamental to life in a free society in terms of a person making their own choices with regard to that part of their life, that we're going to call those fundamental rights. And we will be going through a series of those. I know a lot of this is repetitive, that's by design. So we will be building this list of fundamental rights. When you see the government substantially interfering with the exercise of one of those, a fundamental right, you apply strict scrutiny. If, on the other hand, what somebody is claiming a right to do is only a low-level right, it's not really that big of a deal, we'll talk about more about how to figure that out, whether a right is fundamental or is low-level. That's an entirely different issue that involves the application of 2 factors. But once you've figured out, is it a fundamental right or is it a low-level right that the government's messing around with? If it's fundamental, you apply strict scrutiny. If it's low-level, you apply rational basis. So here are the 2 key differences between those two levels of review, levels of scrutiny, standards of review, however you want to put it. First big difference is who has the burden of persuasion. And this makes sense too, under strict scrutiny, if the court is strictly scrutinizing the government because the court is suspicious that the government is up to no good, then obviously it's going to place the burden of persuasion, who has to prove what, on the government. Who has the burden in a case is a big deal. That's the party that loses if they don't meet the burden, even if they meet some burden, even if they produce some evidence, even if they make something on the case. If they're right on the line, the party with the burden of persuasion is basically the one who gets punished if it's a toss-up. So the burden of persuasion in under strict scrutiny is on the government. The burden of persuasion on with a low-level right under rational basis review is on the challenger. And I just keep saying this. This makes sense. If I'm applying strict scrutiny, it's because I'm highly suspicious, because you're interfering with the exercise of a fundamental right. Under those circumstances, it's the government who has to answer the questions. Right? I'm pointing at you, and you have the burden of persuasion. On the other hand, if I don't see anything like that going on, if I'm not terribly suspicious, if it's just a low level, not that big of a deal right that's at issue in my case, okay, I'm applying rational basis review, and under this standard it makes sense that then the burden would be on the challenger. The second big difference between the 2 is the substantive standard. So the first big difference is who has the burden of persuasion, and the second big difference is what is the substantive standard required. Under strict scrutiny, because we are suspicious, we're going to require that and because we found that the government's interfering with a fundamental right, serious stuff, we're going to require that the government have a compelling interest. And you know this from Con Law 1, how strict scrutiny works, right? We're going to require that the government have a compelling interest in doing what it's doing. Furthermore, and as you know, that's more than just important, and it's certainly more than legitimate. It has to be compelling. Usually that means saving lives, saving children, yeah, you know all that stuff. So that's what a compelling interest means. The means side, under strict scrutiny, right, requires that the means be narrowly tailored. So the best available, least restrictive means possible for achieving that compelling interest. Now, so you're kind of familiar with rational basis review. I'm sorry, with strict scrutiny from Con Law 1. The new test here, at least new in terms of us really naming it and applying it, is rational basis review. So how is this going to be different? Well, under rational basis review, when a court is not suspicious, first of all, they're certainly not going to require a compelling interest. Now, remember, the burden is on the challenger, but we're talking here now substantively. What are we looking for? What are you looking for if you're a judge? The challenger has the burden, but what I'm looking for here is not a compelling interest, it's just a legitimate interest. So basically what that means is the challenger would have to show that there is no legitimate interest. So that is really a tough thing. We'll talk more about that in our live session. When you're under rational basis review, you're basically trying to prove a negative, that there's no conceivable legitimate purpose for the government's law. You're the challenging the law, I'm only applying rational basis review, you have the burden, and that's what you have to show. You have to show that the government has no legitimate interest. So you got to sit there taking shots at, right, all of the conceivable ideas about why the government would be trying to do what it's doing. More on that later. You definitely want to be familiar with Lee Optical. I'm going to post a couple slides on this video about that. But let me finish the standard first. The means end, right, of the test. Well, again, this is a means ends test, but it's not a heightened scrutiny means ends test. It is a low level means ends test that is very deferential to the government. So under strict scrutiny, if the means have to be narrowly tailored, we're looking for something much lower than that, and that's what we get. The means under rational basis only have to be rationally related to the achievement of any conceivable legitimate interest. So rationally related, that means sane. Irrational means nuts. So as long as, but in a rational basis case, as long as the government is doing something that a government is competent to do, and as long as the means it's using aren't crazy, as long as they have something to do, right, with achieving the interest, then the government is good to go under rational basis review. Here are some slides that reflect the reading in the Lee Optical case. And the reason this case is so important, even though it's not like one of the leading cases in the book, is you see here how courts behave when they're applying this really low-level deferential rational basis review. And that is, look at the burden here, right? The burden is on the challenger to show that there's no legitimate interest. In Lee Optical, look at the mites and mays that are circled here. What's going on? This is a case where Oklahoma has a law saying ophthalmologists, you have to be a licensed ophthalmologist, right, or to fit lenses to glasses, some ridiculous kind of thing. And the court says we're going to apply rational basis review, right, in this case because there is no fundamental right at issue. What you find out when a court's applying rational basis review, again, is that the challenger here really has to negative every conceivable legitimate interest that the government might come up with. And this is remarkable because what the court does here is to start talking about what the state's interest might have been. Well, maybe the state was trying to do this, or the state might have been trying to do that, or the state may have been trying to do this. So you see what's going on here. This is a heavily deferential standard that favors the state. You know, if you're the lawyer for the government in a rational basis case, you know, you might as well stay in bed and not bother showing up. I don't mean that literally, obviously. But you don't even have to be there. The court, when it's applying rational basis review, this really deferential, low-level rational basis review will start making up reasons for you, even if you're not there to give a reason for yourself. That goes to show you how deferential this test is and how easy it is for the government to pass. Now, we're hammering this point home for a number of different reasons, one of which we'll see how it applies in economic rights cases, including Lee Optical here in the next video, but also because you know how this goes. Every time you learn a rule, right, there's going to be some wrinkle coming down the road. So, but you can take this to the bank. In a case like Lee Optical, where there's an economic right at stake, where there's a non-fundamental right, which we call low-level rights, If that's all that's at stake and a court's applying rational basis review, then this is probably going nowhere for the challenger. The burden is on the challenger, and all the court needs to see is a legitimate purpose, and it'll make them up if it can, and that the means rationally relate to that purpose. So that's the difference between strict scrutiny and rational basis review. They are on opposite ends of the spectrum. Strict scrutiny is what courts apply when they're suspicious. Rational basis is what they apply when they're not. So let's leave this video there, and the next video will be about economic rights. We'll now get into the real business of when is a right fundamental and when is it not. Until then, stay well, stay safe, stay tuned.